Welcome back, everybody, to the video lecture on the birth of the Cold War, 1945 to 1955. This is the first of our PowerPoint lectures in Unit 4 dealing with America during the Cold War. The Cold War begins even before World War II ends. It's possible to see, for example, the seeds of Cold War already planted at the famous Yalta Conference of 1945, featuring the big three allies of Great Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union. As I like to say to my students, just by looking at the picture here, you can almost sense the Cold War being fomented. The body language of the two leaders, Roosevelt and Churchill, contrasted with that of the Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, suggests that perhaps there's not such a great relationship after all between these erstwhile allies. The idea at Yalta for Roosevelt and Churchill, at least, was to try to get some kind of recognition on the part of the Soviet Union that Eastern Europe, which was largely then occupied by the Soviet Army, having fought its way across the east to push the Germans toward Berlin, somehow after the war the Soviets would allow free elections and democratic regimes in Eastern Europe. Of course, that didn't happen. Stalin had no particular intention of allowing independent regimes along the frontier of Eastern Europe, and instead, as Winston Churchill will put it in a speech a year later, an iron curtain of communism had descended across Eastern Europe. A series of regimes from Poland to East Germany to Yugoslavia, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Albania form a kind of cordon off from the West, featuring now communist regimes, or soon to feature communist regimes, ostensibly under the control of the Soviet sphere of influence. So beginning with Yalta then in 1945, February of 45, we can plot a early Cold War chronology from 45 through the early 1950s. These are some of the pivotal points that drive a wedge between the communist Soviet Union and its satellite states and allies and the United States, which will come to represent the sort of antithesis response to the growth of communism. We'll talk a bit about some of these events as we go through the lecture now. Beginning with the Truman Doctrine, I posted a short video for you to watch, of course, featuring Truman announcing what will come to be known as the Truman Doctrine in 1947. Truman was told that he would have to scare the hell out of the American people in order to receive support for American foreign policy objectives, which figured to be quite expensive in essentially policing the free world against communism. It would require a massive military buildup, a massive investment, even of troops stationed at certain flashpoints. Internationally, the development of new weapon systems. It was now the jet age, the rocket age, the atomic age, and the price tag for all of this, for being the arsenal of democracy, only figured to get steeper and steeper. Given that there was not the same immediate visceral threat as had been posed during World War II by the Japanese and the Nazi regime of Germany, the advice to scare the hell out of the American people, to scare them appreciably, to support through taxpayer funds, of course, the arms buildup that would come, and the fear, of course, was to be the fear of communism. In the Truman Doctrine, President Truman had already more or less committed America to helping regimes globally fight communism, and that would mean an ambitious and far-reaching effort on the part of America to provide supplies and weapons and support of other kinds, not at least at this point, including combat troops involved in conflicts globally, but nevertheless an active military presence. At the same time, in 1947, Truman is signing the National Security Act, which goes a long way towards centralizing and bringing under executive authority the armed services, the various branches of the armed services, what had been formerly separate departments of Army, Navy, etc., now will be lodged under the roof of the Department of Defense, and what will become the famous Pentagon building. Creating also, does this act of 1947, the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency, again, both of which are essentially centralized under the executive branch and of presidential authority. It's worth noting that the very concept of national security reflected a type of departure from the standard notion of national defense. National defense implied that a country's obligation was to protect its borders, presumably from outside threats, whereas national security was a far more fluid concept. National security interests might be located almost anywhere, whether internal to the United States or in other global regions. National security assumed a more active participation in those global regions, but it also suggested, again, that the trouble might come from within. There really were no borders or boundaries to national security, rather similar to that other fluid concept that we know so well today, the war on terror. It really gives the president wide latitude in assigning military resources, both globally, but also defining even domestic and internal sorts of threats. Now, Harry Truman was not expected to win election in 1948. Truman had been, of course, FDR's vice president, had become sworn in as president upon the death of Roosevelt, had finished Roosevelt's fourth term, and stood for election in his own right in 1948. Because he had come out in strong support of various civil rights initiatives, including the integration of the armed services, it was just generally understood that many conservative white segregationist Southern Democrats would no longer support Harry Truman. Well, he nevertheless eked out a victory in 1948, and his victory meant that the Republicans had been out of the White House, essentially locked out of the White House since Herbert Hoover in the early 30s. And you can bet that the Republican Party is very interested in finding now the lever, the political lever that would wedge the Democrats out of the White House in 1952, looking ahead to 1952, already sowing the seeds of what would be their strategy to regain presidential power. And of course, the issue, the lever that they choose as a party to begin working is that of anti-communism. Truman's victory and the Republican defeat meant that anti-communism would be used by the Republicans over the next 4 years relentlessly as a wedge issue to regain office. And I have to say that global affairs went a long way toward accommodating this Republican strategy. In 1949, for example, after years of bitter struggle, the communist revolutionary leader Mao Zedong declares victory over the nationalist Chinese, whom the United States had doggedly supported, by the way, declaring victory over the nationalist Chinese and proclaiming now the People's Republic of China, a communist regime now to take its place alongside the Soviet Union as a major world power, declaring itself to be a communist, the world's most populous nation, the People's Republic of China would now be a force to reckon with, and signaled an apparent sort of rooting of communism in the Far East. During the same year, and in some ways even a more startling announcement, the Soviet Union explodes its first nuclear weapon, its first atomic bomb, at its testing range in Central Asia in the Kazakhstan steppe. The upper atmospheric tests conducted by American scientists proved that the explosion had been of a atomic nature. The high levels of radiation in the upper atmosphere confirmed that. And so now it seemed the Soviet Union had the bomb, something that came as a great surprise to the Western allies, given that conventional thinking had been that it would take many years before the Soviets to somehow catch up to the Americans in developing an atomic bomb. America loses its nuclear monopoly, and no ordinary weapon is this, of course. It is the doomsday scenario now. And what was more disconcerting, I think, to many Americans, but which played right into the hands again of sort of the politics of fear in the Cold War, was that apparently Americans had been involved and were instrumental in providing secrets, nuclear secrets, to third parties who delivered them to the Soviets, thus hastening the process of developing a bomb. The so-called atomic spy ring in the United States would come to feature a melodrama involving a U.S. Husband and wife couple by the name of Rosenberg. Ethel and Julius Rosenberg would be put on trial and implicated in the passing of atomic secrets and charged with treason. Julius Rosenberg had worked alongside some of the atomic scientists, and his wife seems only to have been guilty of perhaps typing classified documents on the home typewriter, where carbons, FBI agents later found carbons, including classified documents. They were convicted of treason and executed by the United States government. This husband and wife, seemingly middle class, parents of young children, it all seemed to announce that no one was beyond suspicion, that in effect no one was safe from the communist menace. Communists, unlike, say, Nazis in World War II, didn't always wear crisp, bemedaled uniforms or engage in sort of distinctive salutes. Communists might look like your neighbors. Touching off, of course, what we call the Red Scare, and catapulting politicians like Joe McCarthy into prominence. You'll be writing about Joe McCarthy on next week's Exam 4. From a speech in 1950, Senator McCarthy: "Today we are engaged in a final all-out battle between communistic atheism and Christianity. The modern champions of communism have selected this as the time, and ladies and gentlemen, the chips are down. They are truly down," claimed McCarthy. I've posted a video of Senator McCarthy. You can see the man in action for yourself, a man whose name becomes synonymous now with the age of the Red Scare. McCarthyism, a tactic, if you will, to ferret out communists or suspected communists from different branches of American life. Students sometimes wonder, what was up with communism, that it was such a bugaboo, that it was so startling, so frightening to the minds of the American people. And of course, the answer can stretch all the way back to the 19th century with the intellectual foundings of modern communism and the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and their espousal of revolutionary movements. Or we could go to the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, the establishment of the first bona fide communist regime, or what had formerly been the Russian Empire. It was also at that time, of course, you might remember during World War I, that Americans were experiencing a wave of nativist fears, fears of foreign influences, and one of those influences, was the doctrine of communism, which seemed to most Americans to be somehow itself antithetical to traditional American economic, political, cultural, even religious values. The United States refused to recognize the Soviet Union for a decade or more until the 1930s, and when it seemed that, ironically, in World War II, that the Soviets would become our allies, there was less said about anti-communism in this country, though as early as 1940, Congress had passed something called the Smith Act. The Smith Act read that anyone knowingly or willfully advocating, abetting, advising, or teaching the duty, necessity, desirability, or propriety of overthrowing the government of the United States or of any state by force or violence, or for anyone to organize any association which teaches, advises, or encourages such an overthrow, or for anyone to become a member of or to affiliate with any such association, would now be guilty of a federal crime. In effect, it was made illegal to belong to the Communist Party. Now, after World War II, the anti-communist politics will heat up, as we've already said, particularly after Truman's unexpected election victory in '48. Already, Richard Nixon, a young congressman from California, had settled into a prominent role in a congressional committee known as the House Un-American Activities Committee, otherwise referred to by its initials as HUAC. Nixon was one of the leading lights of the committee that took upon itself to investigate, in particular, communist influences in various walks of American life. That included organizations sort of deemed radical organizations, civil rights organizations, civil liberties, or like the American Civil Liberties Union, but also seemingly mainstream or ordinary organizations like the Boy Scouts of America. The Boy Scouts were were investigated by HUAC because of something in its its charter, something about fostering international understanding. It all seemed to be on the pale, and so the Boy Scouts were investigated. Famously, so too was Hollywood. On a tip from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, HUAC held public hearings and invited testimony from some very well-known actors, including Ronald Reagan, and solicited information about what they knew of communist influence in Hollywood. The basic idea here was, of course, that Hollywood potentially was the world's most powerful propaganda agency, with millions and millions of theatergoers, exposed to what would potentially be subversive or communistic messaging in movies. While you chomped your popcorn and swallowed your Pepsi, being bombarded with subliminal messaging and such from erstwhile communist films. Well, if not that, at least, then certainly a kind of left-wing, perhaps radical political influence at work in Hollywood that HUAC was interested in knowing. And friendly witnesses like Reagan, who, though he had been a lifelong Democrat up to this point, friendly witnesses like Reagan, willing to name names, really created a buzz of publicity. Some actors and directors refused to cooperate with the committee. Ultimately, the so-called Hollywood 10 was held in contempt of Congress for refusing to appear. These were screenwriters and producers and others from Hollywood who the HUAC committee had determined to be persons of interest. It was all very difficult to defend oneself against. If someone like Reagan mentioned your name in a testimony as being as being a suspected communist, and remember, back in the 30s during the Depression, there were lots of different political persuasions at work, and even those who called themselves communists not necessarily understand that idea to mean that they were actively trying to overthrow the government of the United States or anything of that sort. It was almost an intellectual fad for some to claim some association with communists. But nevertheless, if your name was mentioned, it wasn't up to the committee to somehow prove your guilt, only to air the dirty laundry, if you will. Guilt by innuendo, guilt by rumor, guilt by association was just as good. And of course, the Hollywood establishment will react by trying to exonerate itself by blacklisting and refusing employment to those whose names were mentioned, the so-called blacklist. Over in the Senate, watching all this was the junior senator from Wisconsin, Joe McCarthy, who was quite impressed by Nixon's skill in generating publicity for his anti-communist investigations. For his first several years in the Senate, McCarthy had not distinguished himself in any particular way, and facing a re-election prospect in 1952, he began to seize upon the anti-communist issue as having great potential now for sort of fortifying his own career. McCarthy will become famous, of course, and almost synonymous with the anti-communist witch hunts of the late 40s and early 50s, culminating in what comes to be known as the Army McCarthy hearings of 1954, which were televised nationally and pitted Joe McCarthy and his investigative committee against the United States Army, with accusations of harboring communists and being soft on communism. And McCarthy will prove himself to be quite adept at generating attention, and that's why I want you to watch the video on D2L of McCarthy's television appearance in the early 50s. Famously, he delivers a speech in 1950 in Wheeling, West Virginia, as part of a political tour, in which he says the following: "The reason why we find ourselves in a position of impotency is not because our only powerful potential enemy, meaning Russia, has sent men to invade our shores, but rather because of the traitorous actions of those who have been treated so well by this nation. I have in my hand," McCarthy would famously say, to have in his hand a list of communists who he claimed were at work in the United States government, including the State Department, to help fashion America's foreign policy. No wonder that a kind of Cold War culture now was permeating America, a pervasive fear, really. If the advice that Truman had received was to scare the hell out of the American people, well, it seemed that he had, or at least the Cold War now had, created a pervasive culture of fear. The playwright Arthur Miller famously penned a stage play known as The Crucible, which premiered in 1953 on Broadway. The Crucible, which ostensibly told of the Salem witch trials of the 1690s, was a thinly veiled metaphor for the witch hunts of the McCarthy era now. A fascination with science fiction now in the rocket and jet age, the futurism of the 50s, will yield Hollywood movies like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, and these movies sort of fell in line with the new intent of Hollywood to prove itself anti-communist, because what the Invasion of the Body Snatchers posited was the danger of an alien threat. Now, literally in the movie, it's an alien life force, a pod life force that comes to America and shoots its spores into unwary Americans, turning them into zombies, basically. Of course, the message could not be missed that this was communism by another name. One morning you walk outdoors and you're going to work and you wave to your neighbor Joe, and Joe's always a friendly sort, but this morning you wave hello and he looks at you blankly, almost like a zombie, and you realize Joe's not himself. Well, in the movie, Joe's been shot up with alien spores. He's been possessed by an alien being, but the political meaning, really unmistakable, was that Joe had been brainwashed by communists. The Day the Earth Stood Still, a different take on the Cold War. Another alien, this time from Mars, who arrives on Earth to issue a warning. to warn the peoples of Earth that unless they stop their military conflict, their military escalation, that that this alien population will destroy the Earth. The movie, with its again unmistakable message of peace, really struck at the heart of the fear that many Americans had during the Cold War, that somehow World War III, now in the atomic age, was almost an unthinkable proposition. And so the government had to deal with that. Having scared the American people, it would not do to have the country gripped by paralysis and fear, particularly of atomic war, as a doomsday device. The military ran a series of training exercises beginning in 1951 until 1957 called the Desert Rock exercises, located in the arid climes of the Nevada desert, southeastern desert in Nevada. This involved the placing of U.S. military personnel within a proximity of an above-ground nuclear blast. Now, again, I've posted a remarkable government film, which I'm asking you to watch this week, that tells about the Desert Rock exercises, at least from the perspective of the government. It was the Pentagon which in 1953 said that the purpose of these exercises was to, quote, remove from the minds of the troops the folklore and superstition regarding atomic explosions, particularly effects connected with nuclear radiation hazards. Folklore and superstition regarding atomic explosions. Remember, we had already compiled a huge amount of scientific and medical data on the effects of radiation poisoning following the Hiroshima and Nagasaki blasts in Japan in World War II. And it's usually the first question that comes to mind, when students see the film is, well, didn't we know? And of course we did know. But nevertheless, 40,000 men from all branches of the military were put in direct exposure to nuclear fallout, and as were civilians, the so-called downwinders who lived along the Nevada-Utah border. Watch the film, judge for yourself. I'll be interested to see what you have